The Last of Us is one of my favorite video games of all time, and the story plays a huge role in that. With the way the second game played out, I was worried about the TV show. But after the release of The Last of Us Part 1, the PS5 remaster, I had hoped the show would remain faithful to the source material. I'm making this review based on advice from my friend Don, after I told him I was conflicted about Episode 1. I enjoyed the show, but was confused about the changes they made. While voicing through those thoughts, he suggested I make this video instead. I'll start by saying I have no complaints about the people who were cast in the show. I would have preferred the actors used in the game to be used in the show when possible, for example, the actress who played Tess or the actor who played Henry. And this is made even more of a wish because the actress who played Marlene in the game plays Marlene in the show. I just wish they could have done it for everybody. I also want to address the two big elephants in the room. The first being the decision to remove all the violence except for absolutely necessary to the plot. My belief is that violence is part of the world of The Last of Us, and even some of the characters. I'll discuss this further when we get there, but the removal of the violence really impacts everything that The Last of Us is. Secondly, is the change on how the cordyceps virus works. In game, people get infected by spores. In the show, the infection is passed on by tendrils that require direct contact. I'll talk about this again as we go, but it's a fairly drastic change to the way things operate in the world, and in my opinion, creates a plot hole very early in the show. The focus for this video will be about the changes made to the show and less about the show itself. Others are going to have a way better take on that than I will. The show begins with a segment from a TV show in the 60s where two doctors are discussing the possible harms that could come to mankind. I enjoyed this segment and felt it did a good job of explaining the thread of the story, and the game doesn't do this. I do have some issues with it. Firstly, that they slide in the global warming threat being what would trigger evolution and allow fungus to grow in the human body. To this, in the 60s, this wasn't something that was even considered. Instead, the leading thought back then was that the Earth was going to get colder. But that aside, successful lasting evolution takes thousands of years and not 40 years. My other issue is that the doctor speaking mentions that there's no treatment or cure and that it isn't possible to create one. I know the plot of the game, and presuming we keep in line with the most basic of premises, being that Ellie is immune to the infection and they want to create a cure from her, what is the point if the show begins by stating it can't happen? Hopefully this is addressed in a later episode. After the intro sequence, we're introduced to Joel and his daughter, Sarah. Joel's brother, Tommy, appears as well. This is different from the game, as the game opens with Sarah giving Joel his watch at the end of the day. And the infection begins, and Joel kills the neighbor with a gun, and the family escapes together. In the show, we are introduced to the neighbors. There are some shots of Sarah's day that are supposed to hint about how all is not well in the world, including Sarah spending time with the neighbors, and we get a creepy shot of the elderly, wheelchair-bound woman spasming behind her. This is the beginning of the plot hole I mentioned earlier, but I'll talk about that in a bit. After we get the same intro as the game, the show diverts to Joel leaving to go get Tommy out of jail instead of Joel being outside fighting the neighbors. This change shows Sarah interacting with the neighbor's dog, which is killed off camera in the game, and then entering the house. While the scenes in the show are atmospheric and set a good tone, they also show us that the infection is passed on by tendrils that come from the infected's mouth, not by spores. We see that the wheelchair-bound lady has attacked and bitten her family and infected them via the tendrils she has grown. And here lies the plot hole that I can't understand. In the game, breathing spores or getting bitten caused infection. If the infection needs to be passed via tendrils and the wheelchair lady attacked and caused her family to bleed to be able to do this, how was she herself infected? Wouldn't she also need to have tendrils pass the infection to her? And if the infected turn into crazed animals that don't have full control over the amount of energy they expend, wouldn't the wheelchair lady have also been attacked in a similar manner? But the show can't happen if we get hung up on this, so let's move on. Conveniently, Joel and Tommy show up at exactly the correct time. In the game, Joel shoots the neighbor with a gun, and this causes Sarah some trauma, but because we can't have gun violence in the show, Joel whacks her with a wrench. For the most part, the rest of the intro of the game plays out the same here, with one thing that doesn't make any sense to me. In the game, the truck our heroes are trying to escape in gets into an accident with another car. In the show, they chose to show us some planes flying dangerously low to the ground, and then after faking us out with the car collision from the game, a plane crashes, and debris from the crash is what makes the car flip over. The only reason I could have think that they would do this is because it's expensive to do a car crash practically, and doing it in CG would have looked bad, where the CG plane crash is cheaper and passable. We now get fast forwarded to 20 years later and are shown some establishing shots with a small child collapsing out of the quarantine zone. The child is scanned by officers and gets a red signal. The point of this shot is to introduce us to the device that can scan for infection. In the game, people are lined up and scanned, and then when one is infected, is shot dead in the street. But because we can't have gun violence in the show, we have to go this route where the kid is instead euthanized with an injection. Joel and Tess are working body disposal, and for the most part, this isn't so different from the game. Joel is shown selling pills to a guard, which is referenced in the game. The next change comes with the Robert plot point. In the game, Robert screws Tess and Joel over in a gun deal. In the show, Robert is screwing them over a car battery. They show Tess talking to Robert after being injured by his goons, while this is only mentioned in the game. The Firefly attack happens now, allowing Tess to leave, compared to where it happens in the game with Tess and Joel together. We get our introduction to Ellie, where the Fireflies are holding her captive. The audience isn't told why, but I know it's because she's been bitten and hasn't turned yet. In the game, the point between when Ellie is introduced and when we find out she's infected is about 10 minutes of non-combat gameplay and cutscenes. In the show, because we get introduced to Ellie now, 30 minutes pass before we find out she's infected. We next get a divergent plot element where Joel visits a person with access to a radio trying to locate Tommy. In the game, it's been years since Joel and Tommy have spoken, and they were not on good terms when they last did. The reason they want the car battery from Robert is to go look for Tommy, who's been missing for 3 weeks. We do get a line of dialogue where Joel tells Marlene the Fireflies turned Tommy against him, but not more than that, nor do we know why Joel would be motivated to find Tommy if Tommy is turned against Joel. Joel gets drunk and we hear him having some PTSD about Sarah dying. This is the first time the show outright tries to make Joel a sympathetic character, which is the opposite of how he's portrayed in the game, but I'll talk about this in a bit. Again. Outside of some scenes where the Fireflies weren't in the game, the next big difference is Tess and Joel going after Robert. In the game, they pass through a building and have to fight some infected. In the show, no violence means no fighting, and we see a single already dead infected. Also no spores, so we can see our actors' faces. After this in the game, Joel and Tess fight and kill their way through scores of Robert's men until they catch, torture, and kill Robert. In the show, Robert is now trying to sell the battery to the Fireflies instead of the guns, and something went wrong. Off camera, because we can't have violence, and everyone but our key players are dead. This is another way to make Joel sympathetic, and so far the only person he's attacked in the show is the wheelchair lady who was infected, and he hit her once with a pipe wrench. By this point in the game, he shot, fist fought, and strangled maybe 15 people and infected, as well as breaking Robert's arm to interrogate him. The show now changes, and we're told about two future characters, Bill and Frank. In the game, Frank is dead by the time we meet Bill. They have a coded system where they told Joel and Tess about shipments, or if there's trouble, by playing music over the radio. This is new to the show, and I don't mind it, except for Ellie somehow knows that B/F means Bill and Frank. Why not Bob and Felix, or Beverly and Fiona? The last part of the episode that plays out differently from the game is when they get out of town and are caught by guards. In the game, they get found by two guards. Tess shoots one dead and Joel shoots the other. There's also an escape from other guards that you can commit violence against before they make it into the city. In the show, they happen onto a single guard and choose not to attack him even though he's urinating and they could easily take him out. He's the same guard Joel sold pills to. Ellie still stabs him in the leg when being scanned, but instead of triggering the murder, there is a standoff where the guard doesn't want to shoot Joel. We are then again shown Joel suffering from PTSD because he's got an armed soldier with a flashlight pointing at him, and Joel tackles the guard and begins clobbering him. The show doesn't let us know if the guard is dead or not, but in the game, Joel kills his guard because he needs to, with a gun. In the show, Joel reacts to the death of his daughter from 20 years earlier and lashes out. This is the other way they try to make Joel sympathetic, where in the game, he's just doing bad things. Also, no gun violence. Where the game now has you sneak and or fight your way through guards, the show just has our heroes make it to the city, and we get a warning from Bill and Frank that there is trouble ahead. I think this ending is forced and not as good as what happens in the game, but you need to end the episode somewhere, somehow. My main takeaway from the first episode is that this is less of an adaptation and instead a reimagining. They aren't the same characters doing the same things with the same motivations, but if you squint, you can kind of see the similarities. I don't think the show is bad. I also don't think it's The Last of Us. We'll see if I do this for episode 2.